Okay, so I'm going to go back. Since we're in quarantine, I'm going back and narrating some of the earlier videos. Since I've got some free time here in the city, I'm going to play and watch my day one video of when I actually start disassembling the car without the engine and transmission. Um, and then talk about the my process from the earlier videos. So I'm going to add these narrations back into the day 1, 2, 3, and 4 on YouTube. So here's the car. I've got my 14-inch wheels that have been adapted. I've got adapters in the back. And then I've actually machined the front hubs that take 4x100. I don't like the 15-inch wheels. They just look out of proportion. People want bigger wheels, and that's fine. I think the 14s are great. They fit the car proportionally wise, and you can get really good tires. So these are 14x6, 4x100 wheels and tires. Dimension, that's not the word. Diameter wise, I think they're about the same as the 170 by 70 13s. Again, with my digital speedometer, I'm going to be able to adjust the speed either way. So I've actually got Miata donut wheels in the front, and then I'm putting stock Herald wheels in the back just for rolling purposes. I've already mocked up all these lots of different changes, including my bonnet. It was a Mark III bonnet that I converted. Made the front grille section, converted the square turn lights into round headlights, put the Lamar vents into the side, which really sucks the heat out of that engine compartment. Here's my helmet that I use for autocrossing. And I taped over my VIN and body number just to keep it clean. So that yellow tape on the side is just my VIN number. My serial number plate. So I'm just basically stripping down the car. Nothing really exciting here. Again, the purpose of this is I want to kind of record almost all the work that I'm doing on this car from now on. Obviously, I didn't pull the engine and transmission on camera, but you know how easy that is. 3 bolts to remove the bonnet. The whole engine comes out with 4 bolts on the engine mounts and a couple on the drive shaft and transmission mount. You know, some cables and lines, and the whole engine and gearbox comes out. Easiest car in the world to work on. And by one person. Obviously, I'm doing all of this work by myself. They're small enough and easy enough to handle with one person. Obviously, I've got a hoist in the ceiling, so I do ask for help from time to time. My dad will come over, or friends, or neighbors, or my customers will help me. Most of the time, I will need a second pair of hands if I'm moving something that's already painted. Obviously, I don't want to wrangle something around that's already painted and ship the paint. But obviously, I've got my techniques down where I can do almost nearly all the work by myself. Mainly because if you want it done right, do it yourself. There's been times when my wife would come help me, especially bleeding. I usually get my wife to sit in the car and pump the brakes. I think we've all been there. I can't imagine anyone watching this has not had a wife or a girlfriend sit in the car, pump the brakes or the clutch. So the carpet, door panels, and seat covers, the entire interior was one of the first things that I bought when I was driving the car. That was actually part of my inheritance from my grandmother. That was a surprise I never knew about. But That's the one thing that I got from my grandmother after she passed, and I will never forget that. But I think I ended up spending more money on the interior than the rest of the car. But those door panels and the seat covers and all the interior and the carpet, that's literally 20 plus years old. I bought that in 1998. Obviously, the carpet wasn't the best carpet in the world, and it wasn't molded carpet. And that carpet shrunk over the years. Alright, here's a quick view of my new glove box design and my oil pressure gauge. So I'm not a big fan of the cardboard glove box or the wood. A lot of people have made wooden boxes, but I like the metal ones, and I'm going to wrinkle finish it. So that's my mock-up test fit of the metal glove box. This narration may be about 30 or 40 seconds late. Basically, I'm just taking it apart here. Let me jump forward. Alright. Let me see if I can match. Alright, taking the door panel off. Not much to say here. I'm just stripping everything out, taking the door panels out. Being careful with the doors, because I need those to be lined up and latching correctly. The driver's door always fit and closed greatly. Really great. Greatly, is that even a word? Smoothly, at least. The hinges on the passenger side were kind of stiff. I never really had a lot of passengers in the car, so it wasn't a big deal. The other thing that I like, that I do a little bit different, is when I had the seat covers done, I mean, I had the kits, but I had some upholstery guy just clip them in place. I believe the original seat cushions were actually attached to the frame rail on the bottom of the seat, but I only had them attached to the basket, so the wire basket, which is really awesome. Mainly is that if the interior gets wet, I can just lift the whole seat basket out. And the other thing is, if I'm storing it, I can take the seat baskets out and the seat bottoms with the foam, and I don't get like rodents in there, you know, making a nest out of my seat foam. You can see here with the seats without the bottoms. And the other reason is that I noticed my seat foam on the driver's side would get a little low, so I just get out of the car and swap sides, and it makes them wear evenly. I actually have some new seat baskets that I've made, and I will probably actually have those recovered in leather. There's a guy who's done a lot of TR3, TR4 seats in leather for me. He does awesome work, great leather work seat-wise. I may actually send him my seats and those covers and see if he can actually have those redone in leather. Just real leather is just so nice. I've never had real leather before, but I've done it on a lot of customers' cars, and that leather smell and that leather, it's such a nice quality to have leather seats. So here I've got the spot welder. I was trying to figure out exactly how to do the quarter panel. I couldn't quite get the spot welder through the B post to weld the front outer B post to the fender. I was actually considering removing the entire B post off the driver's side and welding it to the fender, and then welding the whole assembled B post with fender back to the car, because obviously I can spot weld the B post on where the door sill is real easily. but I did not go that route. And so here I'm just doing all the bracing in the car. I ended up going across where the soft top frame goes, bolting a bracket in there, and then going door openings to that. What am I welding here? I think I'm welding, I think I just welded the long bolts together for the bolt through the soft top frame in that bracket. You can actually see the vice grip and my hole punch in the corner there. It's an awesome hole punch. Whitney something hole punch brand. Had to have custom die punches, whatever, ordered for that. It's not 1/4 inch hole. It's slightly larger. Some weird random number, 2564, something like that. But it's not 1/4. It's not 5/16. I found if you drill 1/4 inch holes for like a TR3 rocker panel, those holes are too small to get a nice penetrated weld through the hole. Obviously, the larger gauge that you're plug welding, you need a larger hole because your welder will weld to the least resistant metal. So if you got a small hole, you end up filling the hole and not actually plug welding. You're not welding through the other side and getting penetration. So I don't ever use 1/4 inch hole unless it's a small, thinner sheet metal. And I learned that the hard way, trust me. I fully welded a TR3 rocker panel once with 1/4 inch holes that I bought with a 1/4 inch, about a 1/4 inch drill bit, and drilled a bunch of holes and welded it. But those TR3 those rocker panels are thicker than, it's a little bit thicker than 18. But when I welded that rocker panel off, I needed to make an adjustment. I used a screwdriver and the whole thing just fell off. It popped off. Ended up filling every single one of those 1/4 holes and not penetrating and plug welding. Alright, since I'm replacing this whole rear fender, which it had been wrecked once before, I'm just cutting sections out to see what was there. I used a patch panel from another body to repair the wrecked damage, and I didn't quite like the repair from before, so I'm just going to replace the whole panel. And it got a little bit crunched up on the inside fender well. So that inside fender well is a bit crunched up and wrinkled from the wreck. I was trying to repair it for a few minutes, and then I ended up, and you'll see in this video, where I just cut the whole inside lip of the inner fender and remake that with my shrinker stretcher. Here I'm taking the lead work off of the original B-post. You can't weld anywhere near lead. It's dangerous for one thing. It vaporizes, I believe. So I'm trying to get as much of the lead out. Here I'm trying to get as much as the more you cut off, the easier it is to remove. And then I believe I drill most of the spot welds, and then I use my long air chisel to get those welds off. So for a 50-plus-year-old car, that inside fender in the back doesn't look too bad. It does have some factory primer of some sort, but it's not rusty at all. Just obviously it's dusty as hell just because I live on a gravel road and it's 50 years old. But I will paint inside the new fender, and then I prep and clean and hit some more paint on the inside. So the only part of the car that won't be painted is the behind and inside the passenger fender. I don't replace the passenger fender. Considering how much I'm replacing, I should have, but I think it's fine. If it's not broken, don't fix it. And that fender's in really good shape. Again, this body was in really good shape. The center floors are in really good shape. Here's my air chisel. I've got a couple of short bits, which they're all short, and then I actually weld one to another one, so I'll make it really long. Here's my longer one. It works really, really well. If you have like a 10, 12-inch chisel, it's really, really long for spot welds. That thing is awesome because you can actually get a really good angle on it. But because I'm welding that tool steel, I don't know what alloy it is, it doesn't hold up very well. So it does snap off eventually, and I go back to the other chisel. I need to re-weld that and temper it. I've even had my guy at the machine shop weld it, and it still doesn't hold. So slowly taking off the original spot welds. And of course in the back seam there in the back lower end of the fender has got that overlapping seam. There's that overlapping cover seam, whatever you want to call it, trim. Here I am drilling out the rest of the B-post. And again, I considered taking that whole B-post off. But then I was taking a chance that the door latch wouldn't line up. And it worked out okay. Alright, so I'm going to have to repair the bottom inside of the rear fender here. As I remove the rest of the rear fender lip. You can actually see the hole in the front rocker that I cut open. I'm not a big fan of the wiring running underneath the driver's floor mat and carpet. I've always hated that. So I'm going to actually run conduit inside the rocker and sill. But I don't want it knocking around, and I need it to be completely solid and secure because I can't get back inside that rocker panel without cutting it open. So once the fender is ready to go on and the rocker is ready to go on, I go back and I will end up running conduit inside that rocker panel for the wiring harness to the back of the car and for the speakers. Alright, so I'm just welding up some of the cuts that I cut through accidentally because that was a bit too close. And some of the wreckage. It was hit pretty hard, so there's a lot of wrinkling, and some of the wrinkles I had to cut and re-weld where it was stretched. And I don't know about the replacement inner fenders. I don't know if they're the same on all the models with the later one. I have seen them available for the later cars. But the one that I bought for the TR3 were completely wrong. I mean, I got it to work, but fitment-wise, it didn't fit very well. So I ended up just making and patching this inner fender. And luckily, this rear fender was actually really square and fit really, really well. I don't think I had to do any tweaking. I think I had to take a little bit of the lip by the B post off just because it was a little bit too thick where it was bent over. Um, Other than that, that fender fit nearly perfect. Obviously, a lot of dry fitting and test fitting and test fitting and test fitting, but shape-wise, those rear fenders that are British heritage, we're very, very pleased on how they fit. I'm lucky that those are actually available for the Mark 1s. I will probably buy all new fenders for my new early TR4, which will be another GTR, probably. Again, that's down the road. I'm gonna get this one done this year, and then maybe start my GT6 next. Or it started. It's 80% finished. I believe all the metal work is done except for maybe. Actually, the rear valence on my GT6 needs some work and some attention. Other than that, floors, rockers, all that's good to go. Firewall's good to go. And I'll probably film that one too. So maybe next year I'll work on my GT6 Plus Plus. All the metalwork, floors, rockers, and sills on that car are already been done. I did that a while ago. So here I'm playing around with the door gaps, measuring both sides. I keep tweaking it and tweaking it, and I think I ended up putting it back where it was before. I'm not sure exactly what I was trying to achieve here, but I cut the brackets, adjust it, cut the brackets, adjust it. I think I ended up exactly where I was before, so maybe I couldn't get any better. But then again, the fender's only clamped in place with 3 vice grips, so what do you expect? So, yeah, so I'll work on that a couple times, and I ended up just going back to where it was. And the driver door fits really well. So once I get the door gap pretty good shape, I think after this I'll work on the door hinges and then the rockers. Or trim back the rocker and then... No, I've got to patch the inside panel underneath the fender. Alright, so this is going to be the end of day 1. And let's hope I can insert this into the YouTube video online. Alright, on to day 2. I'm going to insert the audio into the YouTube channel day 2 for my project 1147. This is my Mark 1 Spitfire, aka Mark 1 Spitfire 4. So I've removed the right fender. I've got to go in and repair the patches on the bottom of the inner fender body panel. So here I'm getting masking tape and actually taping over exactly where it needs to be cut out because of the contours of the shape where everything blends in. So I put tape on there and then I measure and mark it because it's a 3-dimensional stamp. It's got a lot of twists and turns in it. So I can actually trace that out onto a flat sheet with the masking tape. So I use 18 gauge cold rolled steel on all the sheet metal work that I do. If I'm making it, unless it needs to be thicker, say I'm doing seat belts, then yeah, I'll use like 16 gauge, but most of everything that I use will be 18 gauge cold rolled. So I believe in this video I'll actually do the the inner lip, inner fender repair for the new rear fender. Alright, so here I am making that bottom patch panel. I'm trying to get as much of it as I can before I cut it out. So obviously I need to double check that those panels and everything fits. All the new panels fit to the new piece. So I need to remove all the old pieces and parts behind it. Obviously there's about 3 layers there. And that's one of the only panels, actually the only panel that I replaced on the car was the driver's side inner sill. The driver's side rocker panel was probably the worst. Lots of pinholes when I sandblasted it, and I ended up doing a lot of lead work, fake lead work. It was a lead-free lead work from Eastwood. The flux for that, I guess it was just plain solder. I guess it wasn't lead. Was very corrosive, and the more I worked into filling those pinholes, kind of the worse the sheet metal went. And I think just before I ended up painting it, I ended up cutting and replacing about maybe 20 inches off the bottom of the driver's rocker. Here I am cleaning out some dirt and dust from that square tubing underneath the rear. Just trying to trim all the old stuff out as the new one goes in. See, what else can I say? I got a Herald in the back I'm working on. There's a TR3 behind the bonnet. There's a TR6 behind me. Okay, so I did this work in November. So obviously I posted this on November 17th, but today is March 21st. Since we're in quarantine, I'm coming back and re-editing and actually adding a narration to these videos. Since I didn't have the time and I didn't have the patience to do it, since I was so busy actually doing the work. I'm not running a YouTube channel, but I've got time in the city to go back and narrate these, so I'm going to edit these back in. Hopefully I can do that without reposting them. I hope I can just throw in the audio in this video. But so a couple of days of work on this driver's side in November, and then I ended up taking just about most of all of December off as my wife was in the hospital. My wife needed IV treatments for her CF, so yeah, most of December was spent in the hospital taking care of my wife and her home IVs and her PICC line. Alright, so it looks like I got that panel pretty much good to go, and I ended up taping off the edges so I can weld it in place, and then painted it. So here I am patching the little pieces behind it, or that attach to the, there's kind of a box section that goes from left to right, where the trailing arm brackets go through. And where everything kind of meets at the bottom lip. So I'm just doing a bunch of small little pieces there. I think they're mostly tabs, where there's 90-degree tabs. So I'm basically reattaching the tabs that I cut off before that panel goes back in. And of course, I purposely made that repair panel larger than it should be, or longer, where it actually has the inner flat sill attached. So once that's welded in, and once the inner sill's ready, then I can just trim it back to exactly where it needs to be. Alright, here's my big vice grips holding it in place. Alright, so I tack it in place. Again, this is the first real video series, I guess you can call. Actually got this new action camera on my fancy camera tripod. So my fancy tripod, it's not really meant to be in the garage, it's just getting a nice workout in the garage now. So I don't shoot a lot of film photography anymore, but I'll just use my tripod in the shop for now. Alright, so I installed custom speaker brackets behind these rear panels, and right where the speaker goes through is part of the seam, so I was seam welding part of the inner bodywork. That was just a little couple of inches of seam welding. Alright, so here I'm going to jump in and make a whole new lip for the inner fender. So I'll make this in two sections just because my break is only 24 inches. So I'll make a 90-degree bend, make a break, and I just get my shrinker and stretcher and just go at it. And of course there's a lot of shrinking and stretching in many different directions. I've actually should have went off the actual fender on this particular piece, which I did later on the second piece, but it worked out alright. Yeah, if I had known that that inner fender was wrecked worse than I thought it was, I should have just flipped the fender over and reshaped that panel. These edges, these lips, I should have just remade these lips to the actual new fender first and then put it on the car, but I mean, this is the method that I was doing and it worked. I had to do a little bit more tweaking later on, but the lip was a little bit tighter than I wanted it. But in the end, it turned out alright. So I screw it in place, mark it, carefully trim, and I ended up... okay, so here's the other... No, this is the front section. So here I am actually matching it to the fender. And you can see that fender has actually been on the shelf for many years, probably about 4 or 5 years. If not longer. Actually, I don't remember when I bought that fender, but it's been sitting in the attic for years until I got time to work on it. A lot of dust and overspray on that fender. Right here I am clamping it in place, cutting, drawing the line where I need to cut, and then I actually cut the inner fender out, and I think I even grind it or trim it by hand. Here I cut it out. Actually kind of fun to go back and rewatch these and narrate afterwards. Alright, now I'm cutting the whole lip off, and then I'm going to go back, clean it up, and then tack weld that new lip in place. And I am doing a butt weld on these. So what I've found over the years is that the original sheet metal is probably around 19 gauge. Obviously, you can't really find 19 gauge anywhere. 20 is a little bit too thin. I have used 20 in the past. It works good for the floors because you can get a lot of bead rolls in it without it warping too much. But the 18 gauge welds a lot better. And then this being 18 and 19 gauge, I'm actually able to the butt weld. Butt welding the 20 gauge to the 19, not the greatest in the world. Sometimes you just blow through it. But I've learned that the 18 works really well for butt welding with the original sheet metal. So lots of little tiny tack welds, tack, tack, tack. And since it's such a compound curve, it doesn't really warp. I don't have to worry about warpage. And again, I'm not going that fast. It may look like it in the video, but this is a time lapse. As you can see, I just go back, go back, go back, go back. I'll grind it out, go back. Here I'm taking a measurement for that bottom edge. I have to make sure that bottom fender on the inside fender well closes up so there's no internal holes. Right here I'm making the back piece. Luckily, two 24-inch pieces worked fine. Clean it up, put it in a break, bend it in half. Shrinker stretcher. Shrink, shrink, shrink. Actually, I'm stretching, stretching, stretching here. A lot of stretching for the outside curve radius, and then shrinking on the inside lip. And you can see that fender's only on like one vice grip, and that still lines up to the door really well. So here's just a lot of dry fitting. Right, here I go, cut that section out. Some trimming. And of course I've got to trim and repair the small little panel where the boot floor meets the fender. And there's actually some brazing there. Right where the boot floor has that dip in the very back, there was some factory brazing there, so I had to work around that brazing, grind as much of it off, and then weld through it. I should have test fitted it one more time before this. It was a little bit tight on the back side later on. It's just a little bit tight, but you know, I massaged it in place, so that worked out fine. I've got to do a little repair on the inner fender in the back, and of course the patch on the floor, boot floor where it meets the fender. So I wish I could actually spot weld the inner lip fender to the inner fender well. Because it's just a weird angle, there's no way I can get a spot welder in there because it's basically upside down and there's a fender in the way. So I'll actually have to plug weld those, and I'll have to do that once the car is upside down. So I'm just putting a little reference off the brake hub. Alright, so there's a little hole there I've got to fill on the inner fender well. You can see that little patch panel there, the one that's pre-painted. You can see it's actually squared at the front end, but the inner sill actually has got an angle. It's got about a 45-degree angle. So when that piece eventually goes into place, I'll have to trim that to actually match that. But it gives me more material to work with. Alright, so as long as that entire inner fender is closed off, where I don't have any holes, I don't want any dirt and grime spinning off the tires and getting inside the bodywork. So I'm trying to make sure that that's as tight as possible. Again, I'll probably put seam sealer in there as well around the edges, but the last thing I need is sand and dirt getting flung inside the fenders and rockers. Alright, there I'm drilling a larger hole there for the wiring harness to run through. I don't plan to use it, but if I do need to go back or run the speaker wires, then it's still there. I'll drill that out larger shortly. Alright, now I'm working in the back. I ended up doing this twice. The first one didn't work. First one didn't fit, so I start over. So I carefully make a patch panel for the bottom fender to the floor, to the boot floor, and then I butt weld that to the inner structure. Yeah, here's my second one. It wasn't long enough. I think that's what it was. I don't think it was long enough. Of course, I can always trim it after it's on the car. Alright, so I'm marking on the back side where I need to trim it. Alright, carefully cutting the old pieces out. Of course, that boot floor has a lip, and then the inner structure is just vertical, so there's a lot going on in that little corner. And the fender attaches to it, and then there's that folded lip. The trim panel, the same as the chrome that goes over the top, but this one's painted. Right, I had some seam sealer in there. I'm trying to get the seam sealer out of the way so I can weld it. I used to use 3M's Fast and Firm seam sealer, but I'm not a fan of that anymore. It doesn't really flex very well. It's not very long term. 3M has another one that's not firm. I think it's a urethane seam sealer. Been using that. That works really well. It is more flexible, but the Fast and Firm, I don't know if it's just the way it's designed, but I've had some that actually failed, that just peeled off. I don't know, it'd been on the shelf for 15 years and they just sold it to me in the paint store, but I put some on and a couple days later it peeled off like string cheese. I mean, it was horrible. And that was after I painted it. So I had to go back in there and actually hand paint where the seam sealer pulled off the top coat. Alright, so I'm repairing that bottom lip to the floor, to the boot floor. It's like an S-shaped lip, which then welds to the inner structure. So here's some brazing in there, so that just explodes when you weld next to the brazing. Really nasty stuff. Alright, so that gets cleaned up, and then the larger piece goes in. And then there's a small hole there for the wiring harness for the fuel sender. I may not run it that direction. I'm not really sure. I may actually run it above the tank like the Herald does. Again, I'm going to work on the wiring harness later. I've got most of it built in my head, but the wiring harness I'm going to keep stock color-wise. So I'm going to keep all the factory colors. I'm just going to add the few extras that I'm going to need and just run it in a different orientation with different fuses, different fuse box. Actually, this setup I had two fuse boxes. I had the original dual fuse boxes like the originals, but I had one on the left as stock, and then I added another one on the right side, which ran everything off the accessories. So I didn't like all the accessories running off the key switch. So I actually ran hot to the key switch and the key switch to the second fuse box, and then all the accessories ran through the fuse box. And then I added the headlight fuse onto the extra one as well, because the original factory fuse box fuse for the headlights was actually in the harness behind the steering wheel. So on the early cars, it's actually in line. Obviously, it's not taped, but it's a purple wire that runs into the wiring harness. It comes out of the taped and then goes back into the tape harness, but it's behind the steering column. It's an inline fuse and behind the steering column. So the fuse box for the headlights is a good idea. I mean, granted, headlight fuses don't go very often, and I have had them fail only because I've had the turn signal cancel sheet metal clip, the turn signal cancel clip that's on the steering column. I've actually had that rub through the headlight wiring running from the switch down the column, and it rubbed through the sheathing and the wiring and shorted out and blew the fuse. That happened to me once. After that, I had to totally redo that. The later headlight switches actually include extra wires so you can actually flash without having the headlights on. So every time I put a new headlight switch in, I actually remove those extra wires for the flash pulling, so you can pull the stock forward and back for flashing. The early cars didn't have that, but I cut those wires out because it gives me more room for the harness to run down through the column, out the bottom of the steering column, where the turn signal cancel clip doesn't rub against the harness. and short out. I mean, I don't ever use the flash function on most cars. Occasionally I'll do in the truck, but that's not a feature that I have to have. Alright, looks like I've got all of the internal fender well repaired, so I'm cleaning up and sanding, wipe it down, blow it off. I think I'll wipe it down with lacquer thinner. And you can see some of the original red. That must be either the primer or the overspray signal red. Actually, at this point, I think it might have been 30, 40 degrees inside the garage, maybe 40 degrees. I think I had the heater on as well, but anyway, it was cold in the garage, so I hit it with a torch, get it nice and 70 degrees, trying to get that surface nice and warm. And then I spray that internal fender well. So that gets a nice coat of engine paint, high temperature engine paint. And then I got to clean up the inside of the fender and then hit that with some paint as well. And of course I got to get the paper off. Don't need to have stickers collecting moisture inside my body. Trying to get as much of that off with lacquer thinner. So yeah, so I'll wipe and clean that inner, the rear fender, and I get that painted. I let that cure for a little while, and then the next video I start installation and then rocker repair. Alright, here we are, narration on day 3 of Project 1147. Oh, here's the TR6 that I've been working on. Well, there's a glimpse of it. Alright, I got the rear fender, inner and outer, repaired, painted, and I'll let that cure as I move along to the door hinges and then rocker and sill. A lot of work on the sills and rockers for this this side. So I bought really good hinges from UK, which they should have been really good hinges, but they weren't. The pins were actually loose. I wasn't very happy with that. Okay, so here's a piece of angle iron, and I'll talk about it later. Here's me actually making it. So I've got a slight, small piece of angle iron. It's right above the rocker and sill, where the door sill pushes on. So I'm tack welding these little brackets, and then I'm going to screw those into the reinforcements. So right as an angle iron meets that corner, I know that's where the corner of the rocker and sill needs to be in most dimensions. Up, down, vertically, side to side. And of course, the sheet metal screws, I can just pop it out, put it back in. I have had issues where some of those were actually too high or too low. So when you do put the door on later on, there's either too much of a gap or too small of a gap. So that's just a really good reference. And of course it's removable. Alright, so I'm cutting out the rocker. That's a nice little throw. Here I am looking at the inner sill. There's a lot of little patches there that I did before. So because the original rocker had a lot of pinholes, I was trying to do the lead work. And just before I painted it, I didn't like it. I wasn't happy with it. So I ended up cutting that section out and doing some patchwork, and then noticing the inner sill wasn't great, so I did a little small, like 1.5 inch patch. So it was a patch on top of a patch. Again, I might have mentioned this before, but I was actually broke and unemployed at this time. So when I rushed this body work, I was trying to get the car ready for the road because I was planning to move to Hawaii with the car. So I was a bit in a hurry and on a budget. But it was solid. No fiberglass, no cutting corners, structurally at least. So you can see the inner sill that I replaced once before. I actually dated it, 2006. So obviously I can't test fit the rocker without the old one off first. So here's the A-post filler coming off, drilling the spot weld out, clamping the center outer sill, the flat one, clamping that in place, drilling out and removing the rest of the rocker. Carefully trim it, then drill it and pull it off, or chisel it off. Test fitting, cleaning the A-post filler, getting that ready. It's interesting to see how this was originally assembled. I've never seen pictures of body shells in the assembly, so I don't know how they spot welded all of these panels in which order, because it's quite interesting to see. Obviously you couldn't spot weld that filler piece on the car. You couldn't get a spot welder inside the rocker panel to weld that filler piece. So that filler piece had to go on the rocker first, and then the rocker go on top. But then the front filler piece has to go in first, because that's spot welded on the inside as well. So what is the order and procedure of assembling the body shell? I've never seen pictures. I've seen pictures on VTR and of a lot of the body shells rolling around the factory or in the paint booth, but I've never actually seen pictures in the factory body shells being assembled. Maybe the TR7s. I think there's some pictures of the 7s going through spoke, maybe. Alright, here I am prepping the edges so I can spot weld and plug weld. And you can see the new rear fender is just one vice grip holding it in place, and the gap looks really good so far. And it's not even welded yet. A lot of prep work on spot welding. You gotta have metal clean on both sides. I gotta get the sticker off. Alright, here I am. Looks like I'm massaging some pieces and parts. So the inner fender is still in place. I've got to cut that section out. Alright, I'm going to weld. Alright, so I guess I'm tack welding the flat inner sill first, outer sill, before I remove the inner sill. So I trimmed that bottom repair that I replaced already to the angle of the flat sill, and you can see it matches the front section pretty well. I think I ended up just tacking that, and I pieced a few sections here just because it's got so many different shapes and angles to it. And again, a lot of times I make the pieces larger than they need to be. Like vertically, I make this longer so it actually sticks out of the bottom. So when I do put the floors and rockers on, I can just trim it back, not a big deal. Gives me more material to work with, to weld with. Alright, so I tack, okay, so now I'm spot welding that piece where it needs to be. And I've got that template screwed in place. So I got that patch panel spot welded to the sill, and I'm kind of tweaking it, and then I'll tack it to the original body. There we go, welded. And then I think I ended up cutting the larger sill. No, it looks like I keep doing some patchwork here. And of course there's 3 layers at the bottom lip. You have the floor that comes down at 90 degrees. You have the inner sill, the center sill that's mostly flat. And then you have the outer rocker that comes down. So you have 3 layers right there at the bottom. So this, at least in my opinion, this car is half unibody. The TRs are full frame. The Heralds have a full frame. But these cars are usually, I consider them half unibodies. It's a wishbone frame down the center, but there's nothing supporting on the outside. So the sills and rockers that are 3 layers all welded together. So that gives the structural support on the outside of the car. There is no frame member except for the outrigger in the front holding the car together on the outside. So this is why it's really important to get the sills and rockers welded and solid and steel. You can't use fiberglass. You can fill holes with fiberglass, but they're not structural, not on old rusty cars. I mean, there are methods of doing it correctly, but no one seems to know how to do it. You got to sandblast. You've got to get it perfectly bare metal to put any glass or resin on metal. And the problem is that the car will flex more in the glass, and then it will crack and pop off. And then you'll get moisture and it'll rust. So yeah, fiberglass is just the devil's work on these cars. Alright, test fitting the rocker. Door, what am I doing to the door here? Oh, I think the speaker's in the way. I think take the speaker box out. Alright, there, I'm drilling vertically because here I start laying conduit. So I'm going to run conduit in electrical conduit. I was thinking about doing metal, but I didn't want it rusting. So this is a PVC conduit that's running inside the fender and rocker. But I've got to make these brackets so it holds it in place and doesn't rattle around. And of course I do some drain holes in the bottom, so if any moisture or water gets in that tube, it'll drain out. A couple of small holes. Obviously, the idea of a plastic conduit's not the greatest in the world. It's not very period. I mean, obviously, metal would have been better, but the plastic in this it's designed for wiring, so I can just push it through without it snagging. Obviously, a steel pipe would have been better, but then again, it's rusty. It's prone to rust. Alright, here I'm making all these little brackets and getting the glue, and I'm going to glue the pieces together. So I'm gluing a union on the top and the front. So the union is on the inside of the car. There's the speaker box. So I'm going to glue the union in place, slip it through the hole so it passes through the front. Oh, I was looking at the floors because the actual the seat belt brackets are different on the floors. The original seatbelt brackets eye bolts were actually far back in the corner behind the seat. The new floors are actually about 4 inches forward. Here's the inner sill. So here's my habit of writing things on it. This one I think I write something about my mom and my wife, and then I clear coat it. It's kind of a time capsule, I guess you call it. Alright, so I cut the floor corner out, cut the inner sill out. I got the new one kind of test fitted in place. Here I'm drilling and cutting the front filler for the rocker and the rest of the lip. And I think I'm ready to work on the inner sill. So this is before I got my second camera. And of course you just see the backside most of the time in these early videos, but later on I put a second camera for the inside. It's a bit difficult for me to edit between shots forward and back. It's kind of interesting to see both, but because it's time lapse, I'm just using both cameras and just showing different angles instead of editing back and forth, camera 1, camera 2. It's very, I tried to spend a couple days editing the videos where the camera followed what I was doing. But then when I was doing the narration, it was completely wrong and out of order, so that's why I have a couple of days of work repeated due to camera 2. So I'm doing some repair in front as the inner sill is about ready to go in. Looks like I'm good to go. So I tack weld the top, so if I need to remove it, I can remove it. And then I double check everything. Well, here's some more cleaning. So I'm going to double check the rocker panel. And then here I actually have those adjustable screws, bolts with those brackets that I talk about later in the video, where I can actually screw the bolts in and out to get the perfect door gap. So I think this is when I actually make those brackets. So I'm welding nuts to the end of these. I'm welding nuts so I can thread in bolts. So when I put these brackets in place, I can actually thread the bolts in and out to push and adjust the door gap where I need them to be. So here's the front one. Weld the nut in place, weld the brace in place, and then thread the bolt in. And then I can just thread it out and push it out so I can get that door gap. And you can see that I'm always looking and feeling and then comparing it to the other side, and I'm measuring the other side and making sure that rocker's in the right place. And this is before the inner sill is fully welded. It's only tacked in place. Double checking the other side, getting some dimensions, measuring. So the front's in pretty good shape, but the back needs to be pushed out a bit. So I believe here I'll get another piece of angle iron and weld a nut to it. Right, here's that. Alright, looks like I'm happy with the inner sill. Checking out my tongs, the new short tongs. I decided to keep the long tongs on, and I spot weld the inner sill, and then I plug weld a few. It's important to keep those tong tips not too hot. The tips are actually threaded, so you can actually change the tips. But if you get them too hot, those the threads will go soft, and you can't remove them. If you can't remove the tips, you can't replace them, so that they ruin the tongs. Learned that the hard way. Alright, now I'm welding the inner sill from the inside. It's kind of cool to see the welds come through in the video. Alright, so I'm cleaning up, prepping. Alright, here I am back to the conduit, and I'm making the brackets to hold it in place, because I don't want that conduit moving around. So make these brackets, drill a hole, run the piping through the hole, then tack the brackets in place, and then a couple more in the top rear. Have to make sure it doesn't interfere with the rocker. Alright, here's the glue, pipe glue. Purple cleaning stuff, and then the glue. So I'm gluing the first one up front, inside. There's the little drain holes that I drill through the conduit. A couple of small 1/8 inch holes, nothing big that the wire's going to catch. Yeah, so tack welding the brackets for the conduit. So the conduit's pretty much good to go. And then we're coming up the end of day 3. Double checking the fenders and rockers, and then on the next day I think I come in and do some more tweaking, and then I come in and start welding the rockers and fenders in place. Alright, here's day 4. Obviously this is after my wife was in the hospital. Had a lot of time for the paint prep work to cure. Here I am ready to, the rocker test fitted. The rocker is good to go. Test fitting wise, I think I go in there and finish welding the tabs and the brackets holding the conduit. And then I'm about ready to fully weld the new fender. I need to come in and finish welding the brackets to hold the conduit in the back there. And then some touch-up paint. Obviously, I don't want anything bare metal, so I go in, hit some paint on the inner outer sill and those brackets and the conduit. Taping off my welding edges, seams. Prepping the B post. That's really a difficult area to work in. It's hard to spot weld something that close and that tight. So a lot of double working, a lot of double checking of this fender before I start tacking it. Obviously I got to punch some holes in it as well. So I do a little bit of finessing for the rear. Hammer out a couple little dings that I had. And prepping the edges for spot welding. I think the bulb of my light went out. So yeah, just lots of prep work. Yep, that doesn't help. Alright, double checking the rocker and the fender. Comparing the other side. Do a little of trimming. Make sure it fits and make sure that just looking to see where my spot welder can actually reach, and it doesn't really reach too many places. I ended up plug welding most of it. Alright, here I am hole punching the inner lip. So once the car is upside down, I'll be able to plug weld those. And then the top side. Yeah, there's not much room to get the spot welder in. I was hoping to come up from the bottom, but it didn't quite work. There's some British chips I was trying. Everything's British. British tea, British chips, or crisps, as you would say in the UK. Alright, here I am trying to adjust or change my tongs. I was thinking about changing the tongs from the spot welder to the bigger or smaller ones, but I couldn't quite get it into where I need it to be for the B post. I can't get the... I was going to take the tong off, stick it in, and then tighten it, and then spot weld it, but it just didn't work. Alright, here's a wide shot. So yeah, so I ended up plug welding the fender to the B post. It's not ideal, and it's a tight fit to get the MIG welder in that corner, but you gotta do what you gotta do. Alright, I think it's ready to go on. So the bottom lip was a bit tight, so keep adjusting it. Trying to get the level of the fender to match the top of the car. So yeah, lots of moving, clamping, moving, clamping, 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 moving, tweaking, clamping. And once I'm happy, then I start tacking it. Then take the clamps off and double check it. So you can see I take the clamps off and readjust it multiple times. Double checking the other side as well. Checking the door gap, making sure the lip works really well on the inside. And I don't want any gaps or holes in the front inner fender. I want to make sure the gravel and sand doesn't get flung inside. I want to keep that all on the outside. Just make sure that's enclosed very well. Alright, looks like I'm pretty much good to go. Just double checking. Take some pictures, turn on my welder, and start tacking. Kind of nerve-wracking when you first do the first welds, because you don't want to start over or take it off. So I have a couple of top tack welds just so I can grind it off if I have to remove it. Alright, so the top, the rear tacked in place, tack the bottom, bottom front. I think I do a few tacks for the inner lip, which I'll do the rest once it's upside down. A couple of tacks just to keep it in place. And it's quite difficult to weld upside down. It's hard to get that to flow and to penetrate upside down. You get a lot of slag in your nozzle. So you have to make sure that lip in the rear bottom is nice and welded all nice together, tight. I gotta make sure it's tight because I've got that that folded metal lip that goes over that seam, and I'll do that once the car is upside down. Alright, since I've got the fender decked in place, looks like I'm working on the B-post. So I gotta tack the lower lip in place, because that's where the door lip usually sticks out. So I'm tacking that right where I need it to be. And then I can just follow it up the lip of the B-post. And I slowly MIG weld those plugs, plug welding the B-post to the fender. I'll have to go back there and very finely grind that lip. Alright, time for the front and the rocker. Took the Miata spare tire off with my new bolt pattern hubs. Looks like I've got one more little patch to do on the front. Looks like I'm doing the tape. I'm using the tape on the other front filler as a pattern. So put multiple layers of tape, draw it or cut it out, and then peel the tape off, and I got a perfect pattern. It's a lot easier to do than cardboard. And flex is a bit more flexible. Alright, so I drew it, then I cut it out, and then you actually stick the tape on the metal, draw out the outline, and you're good to go. Obviously I gotta clean the sheet metal so I can get a good stick and a good marker. Connect the dots, and I'm doing 2 of these. Cut them out on the metal shear. Do a bend on one edge. I have to hand cut the curve, of course. So double checking the front rocker filler on both sides, and comparing it to the old one as well. So yeah, double checking the front filler on the rocker panel. So once I get the filler matched on this side, I copy it to the other. Then I tack weld and spot weld that filler to the rocker. And then I also do the A-post filler as well. There I am cleaning and prepping and anviling the A-post filler. So since the rocker fits really well, I mean, still have a little bit more work before the rocker goes on, but I'm getting the filler pieces in, taking the old paint off, prepping it, trimming it. And once it's ready to go on, I tack it in place on the rocker on the car. Okay, so that's get the dolly some of that out. Then I fully weld the A post filler. Obviously, welding between your legs is probably not the smartest thing in the world, but they're just small tacks, even though it looks fast on camera. Alright, A-post filler done. Let's get the front filler in. And then I tack it in place. Of course, I've marked it once it was on the car. Then I get to hammer it out on the anvil, double check it. Everything looks fine. Get a tight hammered fit in the corner. I both spot weld it and MIG weld it as well. Alright, so it's time to clean the rocker panel since the fillers are ready to go. Clean and prep the rocker panel and the inner sills. Looks like I still have another patch to do next. Alright, so I let that dry. Pull the tape off. Couple more. Alright, time to do the last little patch in the front here. So I draw out the area I need to remove. This is where the floor actually comes up and meets the top of the frame. So it's got an angle to it. Plus there's a reinforcement body bracket behind the floor and the rocker right in this corner. So I gotta work around that. Alright, so I cut the old piece out, copy a new one. Alright, new piece copied. Just need to graft it in place. Alright, so here I'm actually using a small 1/4 inch socket to hammer in that shape where the wiring comes down. Obviously I'm not going to use it, but I still want the shape. So I put a socket next to the sheet metal and I hammer around the socket, and it creates that kind of bead roll effect, but larger and deeper. And then I can blend that into the bottom of that bead roll section there where the wiring comes down. Sometimes you can place the socket in a vise, clamp the sheet metal and the socket together, and then hammer around it, and you can actually stretch the metal around the socket. You can actually get a nice tight little bead roll effect with that. Sometimes you can do it with a torch too. Alright, so this is the last patch panel before the rocker, so this gets tacked in place. That gets welded, cleaned up, dressed, and then I hit it with some paint. You can actually see my ignition box above the serial number, right below my helmet right here. That's the actual ignition module that I later on install on the inside with the LED coming out of the body, out of the firewall. So you don't actually see the ignition box on the outside, it will be on the inside, but the blinking LED light that shows that it's firing will still be shown. So it'll be a hidden ignition system. I've never had one of those fail. Even the old ones from the 80s, they still work. Alright, taping up, cleaning up, shooting some paint on this. Double checking where I need to weld, make sure that's clean. Alright, here's the hole punch for the rocker. I actually counted and spaced the top of the rocker underneath the hinges to match the original. I did notice in the late 70 cars, they weren't spot welded. They were MIG welded at the top seam. I've seen later square tails where that has been MIG welded at the top, and it looks like it's been or replaced, but it was actually factory. So the early cars are actually spot welded at the top of the rocker panel below the VIN numbers or under the hinges. But later on, they're not spot welded. They're MIG welded at the top seam, which is really strange. I've seen that multiple times in the later cars. Like, hey, this fender's been replaced, but the rest of it's all factory spot welded, all original, except that it's MIG welded with a seam, half-inch seam, half-inch MIG weld at the top of the rocker, which is really strange. Alright, more prep work, and there's some brazing there in that corner too you gotta work out. Here I am putting some more extra paint underneath that seam. Prep work, cleaning, sanding. Alright, is this the final? Alright, you can see my jig I just took off. The jig goes back on. You can see where the rocker and sill meet at the door seal. So though vertically that's in the correct place. So clamp it in place. Looks like I do need to tweak it a little bit, so I'll massage it in the place. Alright, tacking it. And I believe here I'll do a full weld on the top side, tack the bottom, and I think later on I come back and spot weld the bottom. And then I do a full weld on the rocker. Once the side is done, I go back and do a full weld. Alright, here I am playing with the door gaps, doing a little bit of massaging. It needs a little bit of work in the front. So I tack the bottom. A little more massaging for the door gap in the front. The door gap in the back looks really good. And before I fully weld the top of the rocker panel, I gotta come back and make sure the height is correct. So on comes the bonnet, and I double check the height from the top of the firewall down to the rocker. Compare both sides. Those door gaps look pretty damn good. And here's a little time capsule for my mother. Alright, here's the end of day 4, and let me throw this narration on YouTube. Love you too, Nargis.